Over the past few years, there has been an endless barrage of disturbing reports concerning farm animals being found mutilated for reasons unknown. This is usually performed with surgical precision and under mysterious circumstances. But in 1988, there was one case of an actual human mutilation, so disturbing it wasn't even made public, and there was an active attempt to cover it up. That was until it was enigmatically leaked to the media some 6 years later. Accounts of farm animals being discovered by their owners in various states of evisceration have been around for years, though they really only came to mainstream attention in the 1960s. While horses, cattle and sheep are the most common targets, there have been cases of other livestock being attacked too, and we're not talking about gruesome butchery done for the gratification of the person inflicting it. In most cases, these mutilations are clean, and the wounds caused seem to have been carried out surgically. Mutilated animals are even reported to have been drained of blood and show no sign of it around their wounds. Incisions can appear cauterized. In most cases, various pieces of the body are removed, including the rectum and reproductive organs. This had become so widespread that by 1969, it had been estimated that there had been 10,000 cases of animal mutilation. One can only imagine how many there have been in the years since. But on September 29, 1988, the mysterious mutilations took a turn for the worse and apparently claimed their first human victim. A young boy hunting for birds along the banks of the Billings Reservoir in Sao Paulo, Brazil, stumbled across the corpse of a middle-aged man. This was no ordinary death and initially had all the hallmarks of a murder or a ritualistic killing. Officers from the local Santo Amaro Police Department were quickly on the scene and the area was sealed off. Very soon, a large number of police officers and medical staff had gathered there. Authorities claimed at the time that the victim's demise was a natural one. He was a 53-year-old after all, who suffered from both epilepsy and alcoholism, and frequented the reservoir to fish. They asserted he probably mixed liquor with his medication before swimming to the opposite-facing riverbank to get access to better fishing, and died from a heart attack during the swim. The identity of this individual was determined largely by dental records, but was not divulged to the public out of respect for the victim's family. Due to the unusual nature of the trauma inflicted to the body, the details of the grisly death were quietly swept under the rug with the hope that it would be forgotten about. Believing there was no story here, it was barely discussed by the local media and quietly slipped into obscurity, almost becoming something akin to folklore. This was how it could have remained until an unofficial leak to the press some 6 years later, in which all the brutal details of the incident came spilling out into the public. In 1994, the coroner's report and crime scene photographs were released to the press by persons unknown, possibly by someone working on a government level who had been disturbed enough by the case to disclose the information to the public. The report made for very grim and disturbing reading. It transpired the victim in the reservoir had anything but a normal death, as the authorities had claimed 6 years previously. He had apparently been subjected to a litany of surgical procedures while being fully conscious. Case in point, his eyelids had been cut away and his eyeballs had been extracted. His tongue had been removed while the left ear had been sliced off. His lips and the flesh around his mandibles had been excised, and a significant piece of the jawbone was missing. The armpits had each been punctured by a single hole around 1 inch in diameter, and similar holes were found elsewhere on the legs and arms, where entire muscles had been removed. These apertures were all uniform in size and were found to be symmetrically aligned with each other. The liver, kidneys, stomach, large and small intestines and pancreas were all missing, and the chest and stomach had shrunken inwards as a result. Strangely, there was no incision in the abdomen other than a small hole, which seemed to imply that the missing organs and muscle tissues had been actually vacuumed out of the body by some unknown method of extraction. The victim's colon had also been bored out. He had also been castrated, and every single drop of blood had been drained from his body. When trying to determine which instruments had been used to inflict such injuries, investigators found that the wounds had been executed with speed and precision. There was a distinct lack of blood outside the body because the wounds had been cauterized. Rigor mortis had not yet set in, despite the death having occurred more than 24 hours beforehand, and the corpse did not emit the usual foul odours. Even though the body had been covered with vultures when it was discovered, there were no signs that he had consumed any of it. Toxicology reports showed no signs of anesthesia or paralysing agent had been administered, meaning at the time these injuries were inflicted, the victim would have been fully conscious and must have been paralysed by some unknown means, as there were no signs of restraints on the body. The presence of a cerebral edema in the skull without the expected cranial trauma was indicative of an agonizing death. The victim basically died of cardiac arrest brought on by extreme pain. The coroner's report also likened the process to his eventual death to that of torture. Decades later, and we are still asking what did transpire all those years ago on the banks of the Billings Reservoir. Some have speculated the damage to the body was done by burrowing rodents which preyed upon the cadaver after death. But this theory leaves out the apparent cauterization visible on some of the wounds. Even the coroner said as much. Then came the possibility of some type of sacrificial killing. Had the man fallen victim to a cult? As Satanists had been blamed on previous animal mutilations, was there a possibility that the man fell foul of a group who kidnapped him for ritualistic slaughter, dumping the body on the banks of the river once the ceremony had been completed? Once again, this was deemed unlikely, as there were no indication of restraints or signs of any kind of struggle, nor were there any footprints near the body, which would have been expected if it were a murder. A gangland hit was considered a possibility. After all, the Billings Reservoir was a frequent site of fatalities. Not a year went by without bodies from numerous gangland murders being dumped there. But this too was ruled out, primarily due to a lack of evidence. And as he was just an ordinary man with his own personal issues who liked to go to the reservoir to fish, it was unlikely he would have been selected for murder by gangs. After these options had been exhausted, the comparisons began being drawn between the case and the multitude of animal mutilations recorded all over the world, much of which have been attributed to possible extraterrestrial experimentation. Even when the coroner was later shown these images of animal mutilations in the years following the incident, he was shocked at how similar they were and said the incisions and wounds on the victim were indicative of the same procedure that was used to mutilate livestock. Then a very disturbing conclusion was arrived at. If extraterrestrials had abducted this man, did they subject him to the same procedure with which they usually subject animals? If this was the case, then the mode of death demonstrated a complete disregard for human life. After all, they carried out a barbaric surgical procedure without anesthetic, while the victim was in a state of paralysis and fully conscious. Clearly, they lacked empathy for their victim and had no issue with the utter agony this man would have gone through. He was in essence treated with the same callousness modern society does with livestock. And if it wasn't extraterrestrials, then what was the cause of it? Why did officials choose to hide the report for 6 years? Who was behind the disclosure? If it was a crime, how was the murderer able to perform such an operation using precision surgical tools, a vacuum device, and no anesthetic agent? And as this unfortunate man's injuries bore a remarkable resemblance to the wounds seen in animal mutilations the world over, can we attribute his demise to whatever is behind the butchering of countless livestock? Like them, was it simply a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or is there something more ominous going on? Until more files on this case are released, or unless a witness to the incident or investigation comes forward, we will never know. What do you think happened to the victim? Jot down your ideas and suggestions in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and remember to tap that bell icon so you never miss an upload.